The needle slipped through Tabitha Preston's finger for the third time that morning, and she barely noticed the blood beading up on her skin because her hands were already shaking so badly from fear. She sat in the back room of Mrs. Henderson's dress shop in St. Louis, Missouri, her threadbare carpetbag already packed and hidden beneath the work table, listening to every footstep that passed on the street outside with her heart hammering against her ribs. Bernard would be looking for her by now. He would have discovered the broken engagement, the returned ring left on his mother's parlor table with a note she had labored over for hours, trying to find words that would not ignite his infamous temper, even though she knew nothing could prevent the rage that would come. The morning light filtered through the dusty window, casting long shadows across the half-finished wedding dress that hung on the dressmaker's form. It was supposed to be her dress, the gown she would wear to marry Bernard Whitmore in just 2 weeks. Instead, it had become a monument to everything she was running from. She had spent 3 months engaged to a man whose charm had concealed a cruelty that only revealed itself in private moments, in the grip of his hand on her arm that left bruises, in the way his voice could turn cold and threatening when she displeased him. Her parents, both dead from influenza the previous winter, could not help her now. She had no brothers, no uncles, no one to turn to in a city where Bernard's family held considerable influence. The newspaper advertisement had seemed like divine intervention when she found it tucked between the society pages 3 days ago. The town of Glenrio, New Mexico Territory, was seeking skilled workers to help build a growing community along the railroad line. Seamstresses were specifically mentioned among the needed trades. New Mexico felt impossibly far from St. Louis, far enough that Bernard might never find her, distant enough that she could disappear into the vast frontier and remake herself into someone new. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her round face creased with worry. She was the only person Tabitha had trusted with the truth, the only one who had seen the bruises and not looked away. "The afternoon train leaves in 2 hours," the older woman said quietly. "You should go now, dear. Take the back way through the alley." Tabitha stood, her legs unsteady, and reached for her carpetbag. Inside were her meager possessions: 2 dresses, her sewing kit with the good German scissors her mother had given her, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the small amount of money she had managed to save from her work at the shop. Mrs. Henderson pressed an envelope into her hands. "It is not much, but it will help you get started," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You are a fine seamstress, Tabitha. Any town would be lucky to have you." Tabitha embraced the woman who had been more of a mother to her these past months than her own employer. "Thank you for everything. I will write when I can." "No," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Do not write, not for a long while. Let yourself disappear completely. That man has a long reach and a longer memory." The words chilled Tabitha, but she knew they were true. She slipped out the back door into the alley, where the smell of horse manure and rotting vegetables assaulted her senses. The journey to the train station took her through parts of St. Louis she had never seen, keeping to the smaller streets and avoiding the main thoroughfares where someone might recognize her. Every man in a dark coat made her heart seize with terror. Every raised voice sent her pulse racing. She bought her ticket with trembling hands, using a false name that the clerk barely glanced at before taking her money. The train to New Mexico would take several days with multiple stops and changes. She would travel through Kansas and into the territory, moving farther from everything she had ever known with each mile of track. The train car was crowded with travelers of all kinds: farmers heading west for cheap land, merchants seeking new markets, families pursuing the promise of a fresh start. Tabitha found a seat near the window and pressed herself into the corner, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. A woman with 3 small children settled across from her, and the noise and chaos of the young ones provided a strange comfort, a distraction from her own churning thoughts. As the train pulled away from the station, Tabitha watched St. Louis recede into the distance. The city where she had been born, where her parents were buried, where she had learned her trade and dreamed of a different future, was disappearing behind her. She felt the tears come then, silent and steady, streaming down her face as the reality of what she was doing finally settled over her. She was 22 years old, alone, traveling to a place she had never seen, with no guarantee of work or shelter or safety. The journey west was an endurance test. The train was hot and airless during the day, cold at night. They stopped at small stations where Tabitha would stretch her legs and buy bread and cheese from platform vendors, always watching over her shoulder for any sign of pursuit. She barely slept, her body rigid with tension, startling awake at every stop and start of the train. Kansas rolled past the window in endless waves of grass and sky. She had never seen so much open space, so much emptiness. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, this vast landscape that seemed to promise room to breathe, room to become someone new. On the 3rd day, they crossed into New Mexico territory. The landscape changed, becoming more arid and wild. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow even though it was late May of 1885. The colors shifted from green to brown and red, the earth itself seeming to burn under the relentless sun. When the train finally pulled into the small station at Glenrio, Tabitha felt her courage nearly fail her. The town was smaller than she had imagined, just a scatter of buildings along the railroad tracks, surrounded by endless desert and scrubland. The platform was rough wooden planks, and the station house was barely more than a shack. She stepped down from the train car with her carpet bag clutched in both hands, looking around at this place that would have to become her home. A hot wind blew dust across the platform, stinging her eyes. There were perhaps a dozen other people getting off the train, most of them men in work clothes heading for the cattle ranches or the railroad crews. A few families with children and bundles of possessions. No one paid any attention to one young woman with a carpet bag and a frightened expression. The town proper consisted of a general store, a saloon, a small church, a livery stable, and a handful of other buildings in various states of construction. The railroad had brought new life to Glenrio, and the town was growing, but it was still rough and unfinished. Tabitha walked slowly down the dusty main street, trying to get her bearings and formulate some kind of plan. She needed to find somewhere to stay and some way to earn money. The envelope Mrs. Henderson had given her contained $20, a generous sum, but not enough to last long. She would need to establish herself quickly. The general store seemed like the best place to start gathering information. A bell jangled as she pushed open the door, and the dimmer interior was a relief after the bright sunlight. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from flour and sugar to farming implements and bolts of fabric. A man stood behind the counter, middle-aged with a weathered face and sharp eyes. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his tone neither friendly nor unfriendly, just cautious in the way of people who had learned not to trust strangers too readily. "I am looking for work," Tabitha said, trying to keep her voice steady and confident. "I am a seamstress. I saw an advertisement back east that said Glenrio needed skilled workers." The man studied her for a moment, taking in her dusty traveling dress and worn carpetbag. "A seamstress, you say? Well, that would be useful. Most folks around here have to send away for ready-made clothes or make do with what they can stitch up themselves. "You any good?" "Very good," Tabitha said, and it was not boasting but simple truth. She had been sewing since she was a child, and her work was known for its precision and artistry. "Well then," the shopkeeper said, warming slightly, "I am Samuel Porter. I run this store along with my wife, Margaret. We have got a small room in the back we have been renting out. Not much, but it is clean and has a lock on the door. You could set up there, do your sewing work. We would take a small percentage of what you make for the rent." It was more than Tabitha had dared hope for. "That would be wonderful, Mr. Porter. Thank you." He showed her the room, which was indeed small but clean, with a narrow bed, a table, and a chair. There was a window that looked out onto the scrubland behind the store, and the door had a sturdy lock. It felt safe, or as safe as anywhere could feel right now. "You got a name?" Mr. Porter asked. Tabitha hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Tabitha Preston," she said, deciding that keeping her real first name would make things easier. If she had to remember to respond to something completely different, she might make a mistake. "Well, Miss Preston, welcome to Glenrio. It is not much of a town yet, but it is honest and hardworking for the most part. You should do all right here if you are as good with a needle as you say." Tabitha moved her few belongings into the room and then asked Mr. Porter if she could purchase some supplies on credit. She needed thread, needles, and, if possible, some fabric to make samples of her work. He agreed, noting the purchases in a ledger, and by evening she had set up her small workspace at the table. That first night in Glenrio, Tabitha lay in the narrow bed listening to unfamiliar sounds. The wind howling across the empty land, the distant yipping of coyotes, the occasional sound of horses and men from the saloon down the street. She was more alone than she had ever been in her life, but she was also free from Bernard's threats, free from the suffocating expectations of St. Louis society. She had chosen this, had taken control of her own fate, and that realization brought a fierce pride even through her fear and uncertainty. In the morning, she began her work in earnest. She sewed a simple but elegant dress from some fabric she had purchased, displaying it in the front window of the general store. She took in mending and alterations, charging fair prices and delivering work that exceeded expectations. Word spread slowly but steadily. The ranchers' wives began to seek her out, needing clothes for growing children or wanting dresses that were more than just functional. She met Mrs. Porter, a kind woman with graying hair who seemed pleased to have another woman in town to talk to. 2 weeks passed, then a month. Tabitha began to feel the tight knot of fear in her chest slowly loosening. She attended church on Sundays, participated in the small community gatherings, and slowly started to believe that she might actually build a life here. The work kept her busy from dawn until late into the night, but she did not mind. The exhaustion helped her sleep, and the routine gave her days structure and purpose. It was on a scorching afternoon in early July when Yates Keller first walked into the general store. Tabitha was in the front, discussing a dress order with Mrs. Porter, when the door opened and a tall man stepped inside. He was lean and weathered, probably in his late 20s, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the New Mexico sky. He wore the practical clothes of a working rancher: worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, scuffed boots, and a hat that had seen better days. There was something quiet and self-contained about him, a stillness that seemed unusual in the often boisterous frontier men she had encountered. He nodded politely to the women and moved to the counter where Mr. Porter was working. "Need some supplies," he said, his voice low and rough, as if he did not use it often. "Sugar, coffee, flour." Tabitha tried not to stare, but there was something about him that caught her attention. Maybe it was the way he carried himself with a kind of understated confidence, or the gentle way he handled the goods Mr. Porter set on the counter. He paid for his purchases, loaded them into a canvas bag, and was nearly out the door when Mrs. Porter called out to him. "Yates, wait a moment. I want you to meet someone." The man turned back, his expression patient but wary. "This is Miss Tabitha Preston," Mrs. Porter said. "She is our new seamstress, been doing wonderful work. Tabitha, this is Yates Keller. He has a ranch about 5 miles north of town. Keeps to himself mostly, but he is good people." "Madam," Yates said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and Tabitha felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. There was something in his gaze, a depth and seriousness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Keller," Tabitha managed to say. He nodded again and then was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft jangle of the bell. "He does not talk much, Mrs. Porter said with a smile. "But he is a good man. Lost his parents to a fever 5 years back and has been running that ranch alone ever since. Works hard, never causes trouble, comes to town maybe once a month for supplies, and that is about it." Tabitha filed the information away and returned to her discussion of dress patterns, but she found her thoughts drifting back to the quiet cowboy with the serious eyes. The summer heat intensified, turning the landscape into a shimmering expanse of dust and rock. Tabitha's business grew steadily. She had enough work to keep her busy and enough income to pay her rent and save a little besides. She made acquaintances among the townspeople, though she kept her past carefully hidden, deflecting questions about where she came from with vague references to Missouri and a desire for a fresh start. She saw Yates Keller in town a few more times over the following months, always at a distance. He would come in for supplies, exchange a few words with Mr. Porter, and then ride back to his ranch. He never sought her out or engaged in conversation, but she noticed that his eyes would sometimes find her across the store, a quick glance before he looked away. She found herself watching for him, listening for the sound of his horse, though she could not have explained why. August brought a rare thunderstorm that turned the dusty streets into rivers of mud. Tabitha was working late in her room, trying to finish a dress for a rancher's daughter, when she heard a commotion outside. Raised voices, the sound of horses, and then a knock at her door that made her freeze with sudden terror. For a wild moment she thought Bernard had found her, that her refuge had been discovered. "Miss Preston, it is Samuel Porter. We need your help." She opened the door to find Mr. Porter and another man supporting a third between them. Even covered in mud and blood, she recognized Yates Keller. His face was pale, his eyes half closed, and there was a gash on his forehead that was bleeding profusely. "What happened?" she gasped. "Horse threw him during the storm," Mr. Porter said. "He managed to ride into town, but he is in bad shape. The doctor is out at the Simmons place tending to a difficult birth. We need somewhere to lay him down." "Bring him in," Tabitha said without hesitation, clearing her work table and spreading a blanket over it. They helped Yates onto the makeshift bed, and he groaned softly, a sound that made Tabitha's heart clench. "I will get some water and clean cloths," she said, forcing herself to move, to focus on what needed to be done rather than the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She had some basic nursing skills, learned from helping her mother tend to sick neighbors back in St. Louis. She cleaned the wound on his forehead carefully, noting that it was not as deep as the amount of blood had suggested. Head wounds always bled dramatically. His shirt was torn and muddy, and when she peeled it back, she found bruising already starting to darken his ribs. She worked methodically, cleaning away the dirt and blood, checking for broken bones with gentle, practiced hands. Yates's eyes opened as she worked, focusing on her face with difficulty. "Sorry for the trouble," he mumbled. "Hush now, Tabitha said softly. "You are hurt. Just rest." "Horse spooked," he said, as if it was important that she understand. "Lightning struck close. Not her fault." "I am sure she did not mean it," Tabitha said, pressing a clean cloth to the cut on his forehead. "Hold this here while I get a bandage." His hand came up to hold the cloth, his fingers brushing against hers. Even injured and muddy, there was a gentleness to his touch that surprised her. She worked quickly, bandaging the wound and checking him over for any other injuries. The ribs were bruised but not broken, and aside from the head wound and various scrapes and bruises, he seemed relatively intact. "You should stay here tonight," she said firmly. "The doctor can check you over when he returns. You took a hard fall and you should not be alone." "Cannot impose," Yates said, trying to sit up and then wincing as his ribs protested. "You can and you will," Tabitha said with a firmness that surprised even her. "I will not have you riding back to your ranch alone in this condition. You can have my bed and I will sleep in the chair." Mr. Porter, who had been watching this exchange with interest, nodded his approval. "She is right, Yates. You stay put. Margaret will bring over some food in a bit." It took some convincing, but eventually Yates agreed, too hurt and exhausted to argue effectively. They helped him to the narrow bed, and Tabitha covered him with a quilt. He was asleep almost immediately, his breathing deep, and even despite his injuries. Tabitha sat in the chair by the window, watching him sleep as the storm raged outside. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, his face looked younger, more vulnerable. She noticed details she had not seen before: the small scar on his chin, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard physical labor. Mrs. Porter brought over a pot of soup and some bread, her eyes twinkling with something that looked suspiciously like matchmaking delight. "You are a good Christian woman, taking care of him like this," she said. Tabitha accepted the food with thanks and ate a little, though her appetite was minimal. The night stretched long and strange, filled with the sound of rain and wind and the quiet breathing of the man in her bed. She dozed in the chair, waking periodically to check on him, to make sure he was still breathing steadily, that he had not taken a turn for the worse. Toward dawn, she woke to find him watching her, his eyes clearer now in the gray morning light. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough. "Of course I stayed," Tabitha replied. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got thrown from a horse," he said, and there was the faintest hint of humor in his tone. He tried to sit up, moving slowly and carefully. "I should go. You have been more than kind." "You should wait for the doctor," Tabitha said, but she could see the determination in his face. He was a man used to being self-sufficient, uncomfortable with accepting help. The doctor arrived an hour later, examined Yates, and pronounced him battered but healing. "Take it easy for a few days," he advised. "No heavy work. Those ribs need time to settle." Yates nodded, thanked Tabitha with an awkwardness that was somehow endearing, and left with his supplies. Tabitha watched him ride away, sitting carefully in the saddle, and felt an odd sense of loss now that her small room was empty again. The incident seemed to change something between them, though Tabitha could not quite define what. The next time Yates came to town, he stopped by the general store and specifically sought her out. He had a shirt that needed mending, a tear in the sleeve that he presented to her with an almost shy request for her help. "Of course," Tabitha said, taking the shirt. The fabric was worn but clean, and she could tell it was one of his better ones. "I can have it ready in a few days." "No rush," he said, then hesitated as if wanting to say more but unsure how. She worked on the shirt that evening, taking special care with her stitches, making them small and even. She reinforced the seam and even added a small decorative touch that she thought he might not notice. When he came back to collect it, he did notice, running his fingers over the careful stitching with something like wonder. "This is fine work," he said. "Better than it was new. What do I owe you?" She named a modest price and he paid without haggling, then lingered for a moment. "Would you like to take a walk?" he asked abruptly. "It is a nice evening, cooler than it has been." Tabitha's heart jumped. "I would like that," she said. They walked together through the town and out onto the scrubland beyond, where the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Yates was not a talkative man, but his silence was comfortable, and when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and deliberate. "This land can be hard," he said, looking out over the endless expanse of desert and sky. "But there is a freedom in it, room to breathe." "Yes," Tabitha said softly, understanding exactly what he meant. "Room to start over." He glanced at her, and she saw a question in his eyes, but he did not press. They talked about small things: the town, the weather, the challenges of ranching. He told her about his cattle operation, the struggle to find enough water and good grazing, the constant work that never seemed to end. She talked about her sewing, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from simple fabric and thread. As they walked back toward town, Yates said quietly, "It gets lonely out at the ranch sometimes. Nice to have someone to talk to." "You are welcome to call on me anytime," Tabitha said, her cheeks warming. "I mean if you would like to, for conversation." "I would like that," he said, and his smile, rare and genuine, transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. From that evening on, Yates began coming to town more frequently. He always had some excuse: supplies to buy, equipment to repair, business at the bank. But he would also stop by the general store to see Tabitha, to sit with her in the early evening and talk about everything and nothing. The townspeople noticed, and Tabitha heard the whispers, saw the knowing looks. She should have been worried about her reputation, but somehow with Yates, it felt different. He treated her with a respect and gentleness that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since before Bernard. As September turned to October, and the intense heat finally began to ease, Tabitha realized she was falling in love. It crept up on her slowly, in quiet moments. The way Yates listened when she spoke as if her words truly mattered, the gentle humor that emerged as he grew more comfortable around her, the steadiness of his presence. He was nothing like Bernard with his flash and charm and hidden cruelty. Yates was solid and real, a man whose word meant something, who treated her as an equal. One evening in late October, they were sitting on the bench outside the general store, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Yates had brought her a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked on his way into town, a gesture that had made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Tabitha," he said, his voice serious, "there is something I need to tell you, something you should know about me." Her heart seized with sudden fear. Was he married? Did he have some dark past he had been hiding? "When my parents died," he continued, looking down at his hands, "I was 22, barely knew what I was doing with the ranch. I made a lot of mistakes those first few years. Nearly lost everything more than once. The bank almost took the place last year because I could not make the payments. I worked myself half to death getting caught up, and I am still not out of trouble. The ranch is stable now, but it is not much. Just a small operation, barely profitable." He took a breath, then met her eyes. "I do not have much to offer a woman. A small house that needs repairs, hard work, and a lot of uncertainty. But I have come to care for you, Tabitha, more than I thought possible. You make me think that maybe a lonely ranch could become a home if the right person was there to share it." Tabitha felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yates," she whispered. "I am not asking for anything right now," he said quickly. "I know we have not known each other long. But I wanted you to know how I feel, wanted to be honest with you about where I stand." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I care for you too," she said. "More than I can say. You are the kindest, most genuine man I have ever known." He squeezed her hand gently. "You do not talk about your past much. I figure you have your reasons. I want you to know that whatever you are running from, whatever brought you here, it does not matter to me. I know who you are now, and that is the woman I care about." His words were so perfectly what she needed to hear that she almost broke down completely. She told him then, not everything, but enough. About Bernard, about the engagement that had become a trap, about the bruises and the threats and the desperate flight west. She did not mention Bernard's full name or the specific details that might allow someone to trace her, but she gave Yates the truth of why she had come to Glenrio alone and afraid. Yates listened without interrupting, his face growing harder as she spoke. When she finished, he pulled her gently into his arms, holding her as she cried against his shoulder. "You are safe here," he said fiercely. "I will make sure of it. If that man ever comes looking for you, he will have to go through me." She believed him. In Yates's strong, steady presence, she felt protected in a way that had nothing to do with dominance or control, and everything to do with genuine care and respect. As autumn deepened and the air grew crisp and cold, their courtship continued. Yates brought her to see his ranch, a small spread with a modest house and barns that did indeed need some work. But the land was beautiful in its stark way, and she could see the potential in the buildings, imagine what they could become with time and effort. He introduced her to his cattle, his horses, the ranch cat that kept the barn free of mice. He showed her the improvements he had made, the irrigation system he was trying to develop, the future he was trying to build from hard earth and harder work. "It is not fancy," he said, almost apologetically. "It is wonderful," Tabitha said honestly. She could see herself here in this place he was carving out of the wilderness. Could imagine curtains in the windows, a garden by the house, children playing in the yard someday. The thought should have terrified her after everything with Bernard, but with Yates, it felt like a promise rather than a threat. Winter came to New Mexico, bringing cold nights and occasional snow that dusted the scrubland white. Tabitha's sewing business slowed a bit with the colder weather and the holidays approaching. She spent more time with Yates, and their relationship deepened from friendship and attraction into something more profound. It was a few days before Christmas, with snow falling softly outside, when Yates came to her room with a serious expression that made her heart race. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously. "Tabitha, I have been thinking," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. He started again. "I know we have not been courting long in the traditional sense, only a few months really, but I feel like I have known you much longer, like you have always been meant to be part of my life." He took a breath, then dropped to one knee right there in her small room. "I do not have a fancy ring or pretty words, but I have a heart that is yours if you want it, and a ranch that could be a home for both of us. Tabitha Preston, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tabitha felt the tears come again, but they were joyful this time. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Yates, I will marry you." He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I will take care of you," he promised. "I will keep you safe. You will never have to be afraid again." She kissed him then, her first real kiss, and it was everything a kiss should be. Tender and sweet and full of promise. They were married in the small church in Glenrio on a clear, cold day in early January of 1886. The whole town turned out for the celebration, which surprised Tabitha. She had not realized how much she had become part of this community, how many genuine friendships she had formed. Mrs. Porter cried and fussed over her, helping her dress in the simple but beautiful gown Tabitha had sewn for herself. Mr. Porter walked her down the aisle, since she had no family to do it. Yates stood at the front of the church in a new suit she had made for him, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked toward him. He looked nervous and proud, and so handsome it made her heart ache. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. When Yates slipped the plain gold band onto her finger and promised to love and cherish her for the rest of their lives, Tabitha knew she had finally found what she had been searching for all along: a true home and a genuine partner. The ranch house was cold when they arrived after the small celebration at the church, but Yates had laid a fire in the hearth before they left, and it soon warmed the space. Tabitha looked around her new home with fresh eyes, seeing past the worn furniture and rough walls to the possibilities within. "I know it needs work," Yates said, watching her anxiously. "It is perfect," she said and meant it. "It is ours." That first night as husband and wife, they lay together in the bed that would now be theirs to share, and Yates held her gently, letting her set the pace, never pushing or demanding. After months of fear that intimacy would always be associated with Bernard's brutal expectations, she discovered with Yates a tenderness and respect that slowly healed the wounds she had carried. The winter months were an adjustment. Ranch life was harder than anything Tabitha had experienced. There were animals to tend even in the worst weather, constant repairs to manage, a never-ending list of tasks that demanded attention. But she threw herself into the work with determination. She learned to cook on the cantankerous wood stove, to churn butter, to tend the chickens Yates bought for her. She continued her sewing work, taking orders from town and making curtains and quilts for their own home. Yates was a patient teacher, showing her the rhythms of ranch life without making her feel inadequate or foolish. They worked side by side, and in the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk or read or simply enjoy the comfortable silence of two people who belonged together. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. The cattle calving season meant sleepless nights and constant vigilance. Tabitha found herself helping pull calves, learning the basics of animal husbandry she had never imagined she would need. Her hands, once soft and suited only for delicate needlework, grew strong and capable, though she kept them carefully tended so she could still do her sewing. In April, she realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time. At first, she attributed it to the change in her life, the physical demands and stress. But as the weeks passed and her body began to change in subtle ways, she knew she was carrying Yates's child. She told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Yates, I have news. We are going to have a baby." The look of joy that spread across his face was worth everything. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "Are you sure? Are you well? Do you need to see the doctor?" she laughed, touched by his immediate concern. "I am sure and I am well, healthy and strong. The baby should come in early winter, I think. November or December." "A baby," he said wonderingly, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Tabitha, you have made me the happiest man alive." As summer arrived with its relentless heat, Tabitha's body changed and grew. She continued her work, both at the ranch and with her sewing, though Yates fussed over her constantly, trying to make sure she did not overdo it. She found his protectiveness endearing rather than controlling. He genuinely cared about her well-being, wanted her to be safe and healthy. They made preparations for the baby, turning a small room off their bedroom into a nursery. Tabitha sewed tiny gowns and blankets, her heart swelling with anticipation. She had never imagined she could be this happy, this content. The terror of her flight from St. Louis felt like a lifetime ago, something that had happened to a different person. In late August, a stranger rode up to the ranch. Tabitha was hanging laundry when she saw him approach, and her blood turned to ice. For a terrible moment, she thought it was Bernard, that her past had finally caught up with her. But as the rider came closer, she saw it was a younger man, someone she did not recognize. He dismounted and approached with a polite nod. "Afternoon, madam. I am looking for the Keller ranch. Got some business to discuss." Yates emerged from the barn, his expression cautious. "I am Yates Keller. What can I do for you?" The man introduced himself as a representative from a cattle company looking to buy stock. It was legitimate business, nothing sinister. But the incident left Tabitha shaken, reminding her that her fear of discovery was still lurking just beneath the surface of her new life. That evening, she finally told Yates everything: Bernard's full name, his family's influence, the extent of his cruelty. She had been holding back these details, afraid of bringing her troubles fully into their life together. But she realized that her husband deserved the whole truth. Yates listened with his characteristic quiet intensity. When she finished, he pulled her close. "Thank you for trusting me with this. I know it was not easy to share, but Tabitha, you need to understand something. You are not that frightened woman anymore. You are Tabitha Keller now, my wife, the mother of my child. You have built a new life here, and you have every right to it. If Bernard Whitmore ever shows his face in New Mexico territory, he will find himself dealing with a lot more than one quiet rancher. This community protects its own." His words gave her strength and comfort. She was not alone anymore. She had Yates, had the friends she had made in Glenrio, had a place she belonged. The baby came on a cold December night, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected. The labor was long and difficult, attended by Mrs. Porter and the doctor from town. Yates paced the kitchen, terrified and helpless, listening to Tabitha's cries from the bedroom. When the doctor finally emerged, holding a squalling, red-faced infant wrapped in blankets, Yates nearly collapsed with relief. "You have a son," the doctor said with a grin. "And your wife is tired but doing well. Strong woman you have got there." Yates rushed to Tabitha's side, finding her exhausted but radiant, her hair damp with sweat and her eyes shining. "We have a son," she whispered. They named him James, after Yates's father. He was a healthy baby with a powerful set of lungs and his father's dark hair. Yates held his son with a tenderness that made Tabitha fall in love with him all over again, watching this strong, quiet man cradle their tiny baby with infinite care. The first year of James's life was exhausting and wonderful. Tabitha managed the constant demands of an infant while still helping with the ranch work and taking on occasional sewing projects. Yates proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with James during difficult nights, changing diapers without complaint, marveling at every small milestone. The ranch began to prosper. Yates had made smart decisions with his cattle, and the herd was growing. They were not wealthy by any measure, but they were stable and gradually improving their situation. Yates hired a hand to help with the heavy work, which eased the burden and gave him more time to spend with his family. In the spring of 1888, when James was just over a year old, Tabitha realized she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, her body knowing what to expect. Yates was overjoyed at the prospect of another child, though he worried constantly about Tabitha's health. Their daughter was born in late October, a quick and relatively easy birth that left them both a bit stunned. Sarah was named after Tabitha's mother, a small but beautiful baby with her mother's delicate features and her father's serious eyes. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family, seasons passing in their eternal cycle. James grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father everywhere, wanting to help with every task. Sarah was a quieter baby, content to watch the world with wise eyes from her mother's arms. Tabitha's sewing business continued to thrive. She had built a reputation throughout the region for quality work, and women would travel from neighboring towns to commission dresses and other garments. She hired a young woman from Glenrio to help with the simpler work, teaching her the trade just as Mrs. Henderson had once taught Tabitha. 5 years after their wedding, in the winter of 1891, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was forwarded through a complicated series of addresses, eventually finding its way to Tabitha Keller at the ranch outside Glenrio. The return address was from a law firm in St. Louis. Tabitha's hands shook as she opened it, fear and dread washing over her. But the contents were not what she expected. The letter informed her that Bernard Whitmore had died 6 months earlier, killed in a carriage accident while intoxicated. His estate was being settled, and there were no claims against Tabitha for breach of promise or any other matter. The lawyer writing the letter simply wanted to inform her that if she had any concerns about legal repercussions from the broken engagement, they were now moot. She sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the letter falling from her fingers. Bernard was dead. The threat that had haunted her for 6 years was gone, erased by a random accident. She should have felt relief, triumph even. Instead, she felt a strange emptiness, as if the fear she had carried for so long had become part of her identity. Yates found her there, staring at nothing. He read the letter and then pulled her into his arms. "It is over," he said quietly. "You are truly free now." "I have been free," Tabitha said, realizing the truth of it as she spoke. "Since the day I left St. Louis, since the day I met you, Bernard only had power over me because I gave it to him. But I took it back when I chose to leave, when I chose to build this life." She cried then, not for Bernard but for the frightened young woman she had been, for all the fear and pain she had carried. Yates held her through it, steady and strong, until the tears subsided and she felt lighter, cleansed. That spring, Tabitha made a trip back to St. Louis. It was time to visit her parents' graves to make peace with her past. Yates insisted on coming with her, and they left the children in the capable care of the Porters. The journey east was strange, retracing in reverse the desperate flight she had made 6 years earlier. St. Louis had grown and changed, but the cemetery where her parents were buried remained the same. Tabitha stood before their graves, Yates a silent presence at her side, and told them about her life. About the terror and the flight, about finding Glenrio and Yates, about their grandchildren they would never meet. She told them she was happy, that she had found a good life and a good man, and that she hoped they would be proud of her. She visited Mrs. Henderson, who wept with joy to see Tabitha thriving. They spent an afternoon together, catching up on years of separation, and Tabitha was able to thank the older woman properly for the kindness that had saved her life. The return journey to New Mexico felt like a homecoming. As the train crossed into the territory and the familiar landscape came into view, Tabitha felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged, in the wide open spaces where she had learned to breathe again. The years continued to pass with the particular sweetness that comes from hard-won happiness. James and Sarah grew healthy and strong, joined eventually by 2 more children, Thomas in 1893 and little Margaret in 1896. The ranch prospered, expanding gradually as Yates's careful management and hard work paid off. They were never wealthy, but they were comfortable and secure. Tabitha's reputation as a seamstress extended throughout the territory. She trained several young women in the trade, ensuring that the next generation would have skills to support themselves. She never forgot what it was like to be desperate and alone, and she went out of her way to help other women who found themselves in difficult circumstances. Glenrio grew around them, transforming from a rough frontier town into a proper community with schools and churches, more businesses and families. Tabitha and Yates became respected pillars of the town, known for their generosity and integrity. They hosted gatherings at the ranch, opened their home to travelers in need, and contributed what they could to community improvements. As their 20th wedding anniversary approached in 1906, Yates surprised Tabitha with a gift he had been working on for months. He had hired a carpenter from town to help him build an addition to the house, a bright, spacious room with large windows that faced south to catch the light. It was a proper sewing room with built-in shelves for her fabric and supplies, a large cutting table, and space for multiple projects. "You have worked at that kitchen table for 20 years, Yates said as he showed her the finished room. "Figured it was time you had a proper space of your own." Tabitha stood in the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. The windows framed views of the land they had worked together to improve, the ranch that had become their legacy. "It is perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You are perfect." He pulled her close, his arms still strong despite the gray threading through his dark hair. "You took a chance on a quiet cowboy with not much to offer. Best decision I ever made was asking you to share this life with me." "Best decision I ever made was saying yes," Tabitha replied, kissing him with the easy affection of two people who had weathered storms together and come through stronger. That summer, their oldest son James, now 19, announced his intention to marry a young woman from a neighboring ranch. Tabitha helped the bride-to-be sew her wedding dress, remembering her own simple ceremony in the little church in Glenrio 2 decades earlier. The wedding was a joyful affair, the ranch full of friends and family, celebrating the joining of two young lives. Sarah followed a different path, showing an interest in teaching. She attended the newly established normal school in Santa Fe, returning to Glenrio to teach at the local school. She brought books and ideas from the wider world, but she never wanted to leave the land she had grown up on. Thomas proved to have his father's gift with animals and the land. By the time he was 16, he was already managing significant portions of the ranch operation, showing a natural aptitude for the work. Margaret, the youngest, was still finding her way, but she had her mother's artistic sense and her father's quiet determination. As Tabitha approached 50, she sometimes thought about the terrified young woman who had fled St. Louis alone, carrying nothing but a carpet bag and desperate hope. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a story she had heard rather than her own past. She had been transformed by this land, by this man, by the life they had built together from nothing but hard work and love. One evening in the autumn of 1911, Tabitha and Yates sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over land they had worked for 25 years. Their children were grown, building their own lives while staying close to home. The ranch was thriving, a legacy they would leave behind. "You ever regret it?" Yates asked suddenly. "Leaving everything behind, coming to this rough place?" Tabitha took his hand, lacing her fingers through his in the gesture that had become second nature over their decades together. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You offered me your name and this ranch, but you gave me so much more than that. You gave me a home, a family, and a life worth living. You showed me what love should be." "You saved me too," Yates said quietly. "This ranch was just land and buildings before you. You made it a home, made me into more than just a lonely cowboy working himself to death." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their journey from strangers to partners to the deep, abiding love that had sustained them through everything. Tabitha thought about the advertisement she had seen in a St. Louis newspaper so many years ago, the leap of faith that had brought her to New Mexico territory. She thought about the quiet cowboy who had offered her not just his name and his ranch, but his unwavering loyalty and gentle strength. She thought about the family they had created, the life they had built in this wild, beautiful place. The frontier had given her room to become someone new, to shed the fear and pain of her past and grow into a woman of strength and purpose. But it was Yates who had given her the safety to do that growing, who had loved her not despite her scars but with full acceptance of everything she had been and everything she became. As they sat together under the vast New Mexico sky, Tabitha knew that her life had turned out better than she had ever dared to dream during those dark days in St. Louis. The seamstress who had fled alone to the frontier had found everything she needed in the quiet cowboy who offered her his name, his ranch, and most importantly, his heart. The ranch would continue, passed down to their children and their children's children. The community they had helped build would grow and change with the times. But the love story that began with a desperate flight and a quiet offer would endure, woven into the very fabric of the life they had created together in the wild, beautiful land that had become their home. Years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm they had established. Grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch house with laughter and chaos during visits. James and his wife had 3 boys who showed promise as the next generation of ranchers. Sarah married later than expected, choosing a fellow teacher who shared her passion for education, and they had twin girls who were as clever and determined as their mother. Thomas took over increasing responsibility for the ranch's operations, and Margaret discovered a talent for horse breeding that added a new dimension to their business. Tabitha's sewing room became a gathering place for the women of the family and community. She taught her granddaughters to sew, passing down not just the technical skills, but the independence those skills could provide. She told them, in age-appropriate ways, about how she had come west alone and built a new life, emphasizing the importance of being able to support oneself, of having the courage to leave situations that were harmful. The New Mexico Territory achieved statehood in 1912, and the whole community celebrated. Glenrio had grown from a rough railroad town into a proper community with schools, churches, businesses, and the kind of civic pride that comes from people working together to build something lasting. Tabitha and Yates had been part of that building, and they took quiet satisfaction in watching the town flourish. In the summer of 1915, Tabitha was working in her garden when she saw a familiar figure walking up the road to the ranch. It took her a moment to recognize the elderly woman making her way slowly toward the house, but when she did, she dropped her gardening tools and ran forward with tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Henderson. The older woman, now in her 80s and moving with the careful deliberation of age, opened her arms. They embraced in the dusty road, 2 women whose lives had been forever connected by a moment of kindness 3 decades earlier. "I had to see you, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice wavering but strong. "My nephew settled in Albuquerque, and I came west to spend my final years with his family. When I learned how close Glenrio was, I had to come, had to see what became of my brave girl." Tabitha brought her into the house, and they spent the afternoon talking, filling in the gaps of 30 years. Mrs. Henderson met Yates, was introduced to the grandchildren who happened to be visiting, and toured the ranch and the sewing room with evident delight. "You did it," she said to Tabitha as they sat in the sewing room looking out over the land. "You built a beautiful life. I always knew you would. You had that strength in you, even when you were too frightened to see it yourself." "I would not have made it without you," Tabitha said. "You gave me the means to escape, the courage to try. I have never forgotten that." Mrs. Henderson stayed for a week, becoming part of the family with the ease of someone who had always been meant to fit. When she left to return to Albuquerque, she made Tabitha promise to visit, and Tabitha did, traveling several times over the next 2 years to spend time with the woman who had saved her life. When Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1917, Tabitha grieved deeply, but with gratitude for the gift of their final time together. The war in Europe seemed distant from their ranch in New Mexico, but it touched them nonetheless. Several young men from Glenrio enlisted, including one of James's sons who was old enough to serve. The community came together to support the families of those serving, and Tabitha organized efforts to sew and send supplies to the troops. When the war ended and their grandson returned safely home, the relief was profound. The 1920s brought change and modernity. Automobiles became more common, though Yates never quite trusted them, preferring his horses. Electricity came to Glenrio, and eventually they had it run out to the ranch. Tabitha got an electric sewing machine that made her work faster and easier, though she kept her old treadle machine for sentimental reasons. Yates slowed down as he aged, his joints stiff from decades of hard physical labor, but he never fully retired. He would still ride out to check on the cattle, still made the important decisions about the ranch even as Thomas handled more of the daily operations. He and Tabitha spent more time together, taking walks in the evening, sitting on the porch and remembering, planning for the future of their family. In 1926, on their 40th wedding anniversary, the family organized a grand celebration. Children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren filled the ranch house and yard. Friends from throughout the region came to honor the couple who had become legends in their own quiet way. There was food and music and dancing, and speeches that made both Tabitha and Yates blush with their praise. As the sun set on that celebration, Tabitha and Yates slipped away from the crowd to their favorite spot, the porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. Yates pulled her close and they swayed together to the distant music. 40 years, he said softly, feels like both a lifetime and no time at all. Best 40 years anyone could ask for, Tabitha replied, resting her head on his shoulder. Do you remember that first time I saw you in the general store? Yates asked. I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, but you looked so sad and scared. I wanted to know your story, wanted to help somehow. You did help, Tabitha said. You gave me everything. A home, a family, love. You showed me what it meant to be truly safe, truly cherished. You gave me just as much, Yates insisted. A reason to build something beyond just surviving. You made me understand what I was working for, what really mattered. They danced slowly as the stars emerged, surrounded by the land they had worked together for 4 decades, serenaded by the sounds of their family celebrating nearby. It was a perfect moment, crystalline in its completeness. The late 1920s and early 1930s brought hard times with the economic depression that gripped the nation. The ranch struggled along with everyone else, but the foundation Tabitha and Yates had built was strong enough to weather the storm. They helped their neighbors when they could, shared resources, and worked together as a community to survive. Tabitha's sewing business actually increased during these years, as people learned to make do and mend rather than buy new. In 1935, Yates fell ill with pneumonia. He was 78 years old, his body worn from a lifetime of hard work. Tabitha nursed him through the worst of it, sitting by his bedside night and day, refusing to leave him. He recovered but was never quite as strong afterward, the illness having taken something vital from him. They both knew, without speaking of it directly, that their time together was drawing toward its end. They had been blessed with nearly 50 years of marriage, longer than many people got, but it still did not feel like enough. They spent more time together, reminiscing about their lives, making sure their children and grandchildren knew the stories of how they had met, how they had built this legacy. Tabitha was 72 years old in the spring of 1936, still active and sharp despite the inevitable toll of age. She and Yates were sitting on their porch one evening in late May, watching the sunset as they had done countless times before. The day had been warm, and the evening air was perfect, carrying the scent of sage and grass. "I would not change a single thing," Yates said suddenly. "If I could go back and live my life again, I would make all the same choices, especially the choice to offer my name and this ranch to a beautiful, frightened seamstress who had come west alone." Tabitha took his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that remained despite age and illness. "And I would make the same choice to accept," she said. "You were my salvation, Yates Keller. You showed me what love really means." He turned to her, his blue eyes still as striking as they had been 50 years earlier, though now framed by wrinkles and age. "Promise me something. When I am gone, and I know that day is not too far off, do not mourn too long. You have been the light of my life, Tabitha. I want you to keep shining, keep living fully for whatever time you have left." "Do not talk like that," she said, her voice breaking. "We have to talk about it, love. We both know. I am not afraid of dying because I have lived such a full life, loved so completely. But I need to know you will be all right." "I will survive," Tabitha said, tears streaming down her face. "But I will never stop missing you, never stop loving you." "Good," Yates said, pulling her close. "Because I will never stop loving you either, not even death will end that." Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 months later, in late July of 1936. Tabitha woke to find him gone, his face peaceful and calm. She held his hand and wept, grieving the loss of her partner, her best friend, the man who had given her everything. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire region. Yates had touched many lives through his quiet kindness and integrity. Person after person told Tabitha stories of how he had helped them, shown them generosity, offered wisdom or support. She realized again how blessed she had been to share her life with such a man. In the months that followed, Tabitha had to learn how to be alone again. It was different from the loneliness she had felt fleeing St. Louis all those years ago. Then she had been desperate and afraid. Now she was surrounded by family and community, supported by the love of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But the specific loneliness of losing a spouse after 50 years of marriage was its own particular grief. She kept herself busy with her sewing, with her family, with the garden and the chickens and all the small tasks of daily life. Thomas ran the ranch now, doing an excellent job of it. The family made sure she was never alone unless she wanted to be, but they also respected her need for space to grieve. On what would have been their 50th wedding anniversary in January of 1937, Tabitha went to the cemetery where Yates was buried. She brought wildflowers even though it was winter, hothouse flowers from a shop in town that she could ill afford but bought anyway because Yates had always brought her wildflowers when he courted her. 50 years, she said to the headstone. "We almost made it to the golden anniversary." "Almost but not quite. I'm not angry though. How can I be angry when we had so much time, so much love? You gave me everything, Yates. A life beyond my wildest dreams. I hope you knew how much I loved you, how grateful I was every single day." She sat by his grave for a long time, talking to him, telling him about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about the ranch and the town and everything he had helped build. She told him she was going to be all right, that he did not need to worry about her. She had learned from him how to be strong, how to face life with courage and grace. Tabitha lived for another 12 years, remaining active and engaged with her family and community. She continued to sew, though her eyes were not as sharp and her fingers not as nimble as they once had been. She taught sewing classes for young women, emphasizing not just the skills but the independence those skills could provide. She volunteered at the church, helped organize community events, and remained a vital presence in Glenrio. She saw grandchildren marry and great-great-grandchildren born. She saw the ranch continue to prosper under Thomas's management, saw her children build good lives filled with purpose and love. She saw the changes brought by World War II, with another generation of young men going off to war, and rejoiced when they returned home safely. She filled journals with her memories, writing down the story of her life for future generations. She wanted them to know where they came from, to understand the courage it took to flee St. Louis, the leap of faith required to accept Yates's proposal, the hard work that went into building the ranch and the family. She wanted them to know that love could heal, that it was possible to overcome fear and trauma and build something beautiful. In the spring of 1949, Tabitha fell ill. She was 85 years old, and her body was simply wearing out. Her children gathered around her bed, along with many of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She was lucid until the end, holding court from her bed, telling stories and giving advice and making sure everyone knew how much she loved them. On a warm May evening, with her children holding her hands and her family surrounding her with love, Tabitha Preston Keller passed away peacefully. Her last words were, "I am coming, Yates. Wait for me." The funeral was, if possible, even larger than Yates's had been. Tabitha had touched countless lives through her kindness, her skill, her willingness to help others. Women testified to how she had taught them sewing skills that allowed them to support their families. People spoke of her generosity, her wisdom, her strength. The church could not hold everyone who came to pay their respects to the seamstress who had fled to the frontier alone and built a legacy of love. They buried her next to Yates, their headstones side by side as they had been in life. The ranch continued under family ownership, passed down through generations as Tabitha and Yates had hoped. The sewing room remained, preserved as Tabitha had left it, a testament to the skill and artistry she had brought west from St. Louis. Their story became family legend, told and retold through the generations. The tale of the frightened seamstress who fled an abusive engagement and the quiet cowboy who offered her his name and ranch, and how their love transformed both of them and created a legacy that endured. In that story, future generations found inspiration and hope. They learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to move forward despite it. They learned that love should be gentle and respectful, that a true partner lifts you up rather than tearing you down. They learned that it was possible to overcome trauma and build something beautiful, that the past did not have to define the future. The ranch still stands, well into the 21st century, still owned by descendants of Tabitha and Yates Keller. The original house has been expanded and modernized, but the bones of it remain, along with the sewing room with its south-facing windows. Family members still gather there for reunions and celebrations, still tell the story of how it all began. In Glenrio, now a small town that has weathered the changes of more than a century, there is a historical society museum. Among the exhibits is a section dedicated to Tabitha Keller, the seamstress who helped build the community. Her sewing kit is displayed there, along with examples of her work. A wedding dress she made for a rancher's daughter in 1887, a quilt stitched with scenes from ranch life, the journals she kept in her later years. Visitors to the museum read her story and are moved by it. They see in her journey a reflection of the broader story of the American West. People fleeing difficult circumstances, seeking fresh starts, building communities from nothing but determination and hope. But more than that, they see a love story, pure and enduring, between two people who found in each other exactly what they needed. The story of Tabitha Preston and Yates Keller reminds us that love can be a refuge and a strength, that sometimes the greatest courage is accepting help when it is offered, and that the most profound legacies are not measured in wealth or fame but in the lives touched and the love shared across generations. Their love story, which began with a desperate flight and a quiet offer, became the foundation for everything that followed. A thriving ranch, a strong family, a vital community. It proved that sometimes the best things come from the most difficult circumstances, that endings can become beginnings, and that love, real love, endures beyond death and time. In the end, Tabitha did exactly what Yates had asked of her. She survived his death, continued living fully, shining her light into the world. And when her time came, she went to him without fear or regret, secure in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved completely. Their story is closed now, complete in every way that matters. The scared young seamstress found safety and love. The quiet cowboy found a partner who transformed his lonely ranch into a home. Together they built something that lasted, something that continues to inspire generations later. And if sometimes, on quiet evenings at the ranch, family members claim to see two figures sitting on the old porch, watching the sunset together with their hands intertwined, well, that is just the sort of enduring love story that Tabitha and Yates always had, the kind that transcends the boundaries of life and death, the kind that truly does last forever.